So, dear friends, the Gospel today combines two separate passages taken from the Gospel of Luke. If you pay attention attentively to the reading, especially the Gospel, first we hear the opening verses where Luke, let's say Luke, the author of the Gospel today, because we do not know individually the author of the Gospel. And that's why we call the Gospel today the Gospel of Luke. And let's say the author of this Gospel is Luke. So Luke establishes the purpose of why he wrote this testimony about Jesus Christ. In this passage, we notice that Luke may have written to a specific person, Theophilus, right? We hear the name of Theophilus here. But the word Theophilus may also be a general reference, by the way. It has functioned as a phrase, dear reader. In some cases, we think that Theophilus is a person. Because in the Gospel today, we don't see the name of Theophilus referred to a person, but rather the most excellent Theophilus. So let's say that when you try to write a letter, usually you would mention the name of that person first. Dear Theophilus, today I'm happy. Thank you so much for your email and everything else, right? The same thing also in the Gospel today, Luke, the author of the Gospel, mentions excellent Theophilus. But we have to pay attention also that the name of Theophilus is not any person, but rather it says, dear reader. So it is because in Greek, the word Theophilus means lover of God. So the author of the Gospel literally tells us that we are the lover of God, each one of us, so that we can pay attention to the word of the Lord directly. So why it is in Greek word, by the way? Because the gospel, what we have now, originally was translated from the Greek. And that's why in the word Theophilus there is no equality in English. That's why in the English words we still use Theophilus, and which is very interesting. But Theophilus means dear reader, dear friends, dear the lover of God. So, just for your information, today's gospel actually skips several chapters in which we should find the infancy narratives. The story of Jesus' baptism by John. Yes, we had 2 weeks ago, but we skip it. Because if you open the gospel again, the story is different. Now, we skip also the story temptation Jesus faced in the desert before he started his ministry, before he received the baptism, after receiving the baptism of John. And the beginning also, Jesus' public ministry, because at this point, Jesus by himself, he had not received or appointed the 12 apostles. Very interesting. So in the chapter 4, especially the Gospel of Luke, we hear that Jesus is in his hometown Nazareth. Now, after we read the prologue from the Gospel of Luke, and suddenly we are offered the story that Jesus is already in his hometown, Nazareth. And he was attending in a synagogue on a Sabbath. In this account, we find another important information that Jesus lived as a faithful Jew. So that's why he went to the synagogue, listened attentively to the readings, as well as participate in the congregations. So one thing we need to pay attention is that the readings today highlight the liturgy of the word, especially in the first reading and also the gospel. During Mass, the liturgy of the word covers all the readings, the homily, the credo, the general intercessions. So the liturgy of the word is an integral part or a very important part of the sacramental celebrations. Not almost, but I do believe all of them in the celebration of the sacraments, you will hear the word of the Lord. First, for instance, in the baptism, we do have the word of the Lord. In the sacrament of confirmations, we do have the word of the Lord. All the sacraments that we are celebrating has the liturgy of the word. So the purpose is to nourish the faith of the faithful. The signs which accompany the word of God are emphasized. And sometimes we have the procession of the book of the gospel before the proclamation, just like what I did. Or usually, deacon will do it before the proclamation of the gospel. That's exactly what we hear in the first reading and also in the gospel today. So the liturgy of the word during Mass is prefigured all the way back to the time of Ezra in the first reading. We heard how, or from the book of Nehemiah in the first reading, the description of what Ezra, the priest, did in the synagogue. It is very similar to what we do in the Mass. There's no doubt and there is no question about that. That's exactly what we hear. So whether we realize it or not, what we are doing in the Holy Eucharist, especially during the liturgy of the words, that's originated in the Old Testament. So that's why we call it, this is a secret liturgy in the Holy Eucharist. Now, going back to the first reading, Ezra was standing higher up. And that's what the priest or deacon usually does, standing at an end and standing higher up. As Ezra opened the scroll, the people rose up, and that's what happened during the gospel in the Holy Eucharist. The people standing to listen to the gospel proclaimed. Then Ezra interpreted the readings for the people, and that's what the priest or deacon or even bishop does after the proclamation of the gospel. He gives the homily. So we learn something new here in the gospel. What we are celebrating in the Holy Eucharist is very biblical, either in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. So whenever we read the Old Testament, especially like what we heard in the gospel in the first reading today, we try to keep in mind that Jesus Christ, because everything written in the Old Testament leads us to Jesus Christ. He is the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. And also Ezra in the Old Testament prefigures Jesus Christ, the eternal high priest, which we heard in the gospel today. And Jesus was handed the scroll of Isaiah to read, and then he gave him a homily to the people by saying, "Today, this passage is fulfilled in your hearing." So it is not a statement, but Jesus gave a homily, very brief, but it is very controversial also for those people who heard what Jesus said at the time. So the liturgy of the word is like from a dialogue. God speaks to us through the readings and the homily, and we respond to him by our profession of faith and interceding on behalf of the church as a whole. That's why for us priests, bishops, or even deacons, or basically ordained ministers, preaching is an important duty in the liturgy, especially in the Holy Eucharist. And I just let you know, in order to give a homily is not really easy, because we have to stick on the gospel as well as the word of the Lord and try to apply to our life. So dear friends, what we learned today in the gospel, that Jesus stands in the synagogue, he reads from the scroll handed to him. It contains the word of the prophet Isaiah, is very important. At this early moment in his ministry, Jesus announces his mission in continuity with Israel's prophetic traditions. So this reading from the book of Isaiah defines Jesus' ministry. We will find more evidence of this as we continue to read from the Gospel of Luke throughout the year. We still have a lot of things that we need to learn from the Gospel. But at least today we can learn from what Jesus said, and also from the Old Testament, where Ezra, the high priest, taught us that the secret liturgy is the moment when God is present. And that's why today we hear in the Gospel that through the book of Isaiah, Jesus fulfilled what God had prophesied. Let us take a moment of silence and internalize the secret liturgy a part of our life. It is very important for us that God is present.